What happens when someone judges a book by its cover, only to discover they've just insulted one of the most powerful people in the building? Sometimes, a single moment of disrespect can trigger a chain of events that exposes the true hierarchy of power. This is the story of Dr. Sarah Chen, a brilliant cybersecurity expert who looked nothing like what the security guards expected when she arrived at the nation's most classified military research facility. Her quiet response to their mockery would shut down an entire base and teach everyone present a lesson they would never forget. In a world where appearances often deceive and assumptions can be dangerous, one woman's calm reaction to humiliation would demonstrate that real power doesn't always come with a uniform or a title. Sometimes it comes with the knowledge of a single code that can stop everything in its tracks. Sarah Chen stepped out of her modest Honda Civic into the scorching Nevada sun, the heat immediately hitting her face like a wall of fire. The military research facility stretched before her like a fortress of concrete and steel, its imposing walls topped with razor wire that gleamed menacingly in the afternoon light. She had driven for 6 hours straight from Los Angeles, stopping only once for gas and a quick sandwich that she barely tasted due to her nerves. At 34, Sarah possessed one of the most brilliant minds in cybersecurity, though her appearance suggested anything but military importance. She stood barely 5 feet 3 inches tall, her shoulder-length black hair pulled back in a simple ponytail that had become disheveled during the long drive. Her clothes were wrinkled from the journey. A plain white button-down shirt, dark jeans, and comfortable sneakers that had seen better days. The only indication of her profession was the battered laptop bag slung over her shoulder and a security clearance badge hanging from a simple lanyard around her neck. The facility's entrance loomed ahead, a checkpoint that looked more like a border crossing than the entry to a research lab. Multiple guard towers flanked the main gate, their windows tinted black and reflecting the harsh sunlight. Sarah could see armed personnel moving behind bulletproof glass, their faces hidden behind sunglasses and stern expressions. This was Joint Base Meridian, one of the most classified military installations in the United States, home to projects that could determine the future of national security. As she approached the first checkpoint, pulling her identification from her pocket with slightly trembling hands, Sarah tried to calm her racing heart. She had been summoned here on an emergency basis, called in to address what her supervisor had described as a critical vulnerability in the base's computer systems. The details had been vague over the phone, but the urgency in Colonel Martinez's voice had been unmistakable. She was to report immediately. No delays, no questions. The first guard, a young man who couldn't have been older than 22, looked up from his paperwork with the expression of someone who had been interrupted during something far more interesting. His name tag read Harrison, and his uniform was crisp enough to suggest he was either new to the position or simply very dedicated to military appearance standards. When he saw Sarah approaching, his eyebrows rose in what could only be described as surprise mixed with amusement. "Excuse me, miss," Harrison said, his tone carrying just enough condescension to make it clear he hadn't bothered to look at her credentials yet. "This is a restricted military facility. Are you lost? The nearest civilian area is about 10 miles back down the highway." His partner, an older sergeant named Williams according to his badge, looked up from his coffee and chuckled softly, the sound carrying clearly in the still desert air. Sarah held out her identification card and security clearance badge, both of which clearly displayed her photograph, full name, and authorization level. "I'm Dr. Sarah Chen," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the flush of embarrassment that was beginning to creep up her neck. "I'm expected. Colonel Martinez called me in for an emergency consultation on the quantum encryption protocols." Harrison barely glanced at the credentials before handing them back to her with a dismissive wave. "Right, sure you are," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm that made Williams laugh outright. "Listen, lady, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but this isn't the place for it. Our cybersecurity experts don't look like—" He paused, his eyes scanning her from head to toe in a way that made her skin crawl. "Well, like you. They're serious professionals, not some college student who got lost on her way to a computer science class." The humiliation hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had spent years dealing with this kind of treatment, the assumption that her appearance somehow negated her qualifications. In graduate school, professors had questioned whether she was in the right classroom. At her previous job at a major tech company, colleagues had mistaken her for an intern despite her senior position. She had thought that in a military setting her security clearance and official summons would speak for themselves. "I understand your caution," Sarah said, her voice remaining calm despite the anger building inside her chest. "But if you could just call Colonel Martinez, he can verify my identity and the urgency of my visit." The vulnerability I'm here to address could compromise the entire base's network security. Williams, who had been enjoying the show from his position behind the bulletproof glass, leaned forward into his microphone. Honey, the only thing you need to address is finding your way back to whatever shopping mall you escaped from. Our systems are protected by the best minds in the military. We don't need some random girl with a fake badge to come in and pretend to save the day. The words stung more than Sarah cared to admit, but what hurt most was the dismissive laughter that followed. Other personnel had begun to notice the commotion, and she could see faces pressed against windows, some grinning at what they clearly viewed as entertainment. A few soldiers had even stopped their duties to watch the show, their arms crossed as they waited to see how the situation would unfold. Harrison was now completely ignoring her presence, turning back to his paperwork as if she had already left. Look, miss, I'm going to have to ask you to return to your vehicle and leave the premises. This is a secure facility, and we can't have civilians wandering around pretending to be important. The dismissal in his voice was absolute, as if he had already forgotten her existence. Sarah stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of every stare, every whispered comment, every barely suppressed laugh. The desert wind picked up, blowing dust across the checkpoint and sending her hair into her face. She pushed it back with a hand that she was proud to note wasn't shaking, despite the humiliation coursing through her veins. She thought about her options. She could argue further, demanding that they contact Colonel Martinez. But it was clear that these guards had made up their minds about who she was and what she represented. She could call the colonel herself, but her phone had no signal this close to the facility's jamming equipment. She could even show them her laptop and some of her credentials, but she suspected that would only invite more mockery. Instead, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She reached into her laptop bag, not for her computer or additional identification, but for a small device that looked unremarkable to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at. It was roughly the size of a smartphone, with a simple black screen and a single USB port. To the casual observer, it might have been a portable battery or some kind of basic electronics tool. But this device was far from ordinary. It was a quantum key generator, one of only 12 in existence, designed specifically for emergency situations involving national security breaches. Sarah had helped design the protocol herself, working with a team of military cybersecurity experts to create a fail-safe system that could immediately isolate any facility if a critical vulnerability was detected. The device required biometric authentication, her fingerprint, retinal scan, and a 16-digit code that changed every 60 seconds based on quantum encryption algorithms. Once activated, it would send an encrypted signal to the facility's main servers, triggering an immediate lockdown protocol that would shut down all non-essential systems and isolate the base from external communications until the threat could be assessed. Sarah had never used the device before. It was meant for the most extreme circumstances, situations where the security of the entire facility was at risk. Using it for personal reasons, even justified ones, could end her career and potentially result in serious legal consequences. But as she stood there, surrounded by laughter and dismissal, she realized that this situation was exactly what the protocol was designed for. A critical security vulnerability had been identified, and the personnel responsible for protecting the facility were refusing to acknowledge the threat. The vulnerability wasn't in the computer systems, as Colonel Martinez had suspected. The vulnerability was in the human element, in the assumption that security threats would always look a certain way, come from expected sources, and present themselves in predictable forms. If she, with her legitimate credentials and official summons, could be turned away so easily, what would happen when a real threat arrived? How many other qualified experts had been dismissed because they didn't fit someone's narrow idea of what a cybersecurity professional should look like? As Harrison continued to ignore her, making jokes with Williams about wannabe hackers and civilians who watch too many spy movies, Sarah made her choice. She pressed her thumb to the device's scanner, looked into the small camera for the retinal scan, and began entering the 16-digit code that would change everything. The device remained silent as it processed her credentials, but Sarah knew that somewhere deep within the facility's servers, systems were already beginning to react to her authentication. In less than 60 seconds, Joint Base Meridian would go into complete lockdown, and everyone present would discover exactly who Dr. Sarah Chen was and why her arrival at their facility was anything but ordinary. She slipped the device back into her bag and stood quietly, waiting for the consequences of her decision to unfold. The guards continued their conversation, oblivious to what was coming, their laughter echoing across the empty desert. as the countdown to lockdown continued invisibly around them. The first sign that something had changed came exactly 57 seconds after Sarah had completed the authentication sequence. A low, mechanical hum began to emanate from somewhere deep within the facility's infrastructure. So subtle at first that only Sarah noticed it. She had heard this sound before, during the testing phases of the lockdown protocol, and she knew that what was coming next would transform the entire atmosphere of Joint Base Meridian. Harrison was in the middle of telling Williams about his weekend plans when the warning lights began to flash. Red beacons that had remained dormant for months suddenly burst to life, bathing the checkpoint in an ominous crimson glow that immediately caught everyone's attention. The casual conversation stopped abruptly, replaced by confusion and the rapid movement of personnel who had been trained to react to emergency situations. Then came the alarm. Not the simple beeping of a smoke detector or the whine of a car alarm, but a deep, penetrating tone that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. It was a sound designed to be impossible to ignore, to cut through any distraction and demand immediate attention from every person within the facility's boundaries. The alarm pulsed in a specific pattern. 3 long tones, followed by 2 short ones, repeating endlessly in a rhythm that military personnel were trained to recognize as Condition Omega, the highest level of security alert. Williams dropped his coffee mug, the ceramic shattering on the concrete floor as hot liquid spread in a dark stain around his boots. "What the hell?" he muttered, his casual demeanor evaporating instantly as years of military training kicked in. He began frantically checking his computer screens, looking for some indication of what had triggered the base-wide emergency. Harrison's face had gone pale, his earlier confidence replaced by visible panic. "This isn't a drill," he said, his voice cracking slightly as he spoke into his radio. "Command, this is Checkpoint Alpha. We have a Condition Omega alert. Please advise on threat assessment and protocols." The radio crackled with static before a harried voice responded. "All checkpoints, maintain positions and prepare for immediate lockdown. No personnel in or out until further notice." Around the checkpoint, the facility had transformed into a scene of controlled chaos. Soldiers who had been lounging in the shade were now running to predetermined positions, their weapons ready and their faces grim. Vehicle barriers that had been lowered began rising from the ground with hydraulic precision, creating impenetrable walls of steel and concrete. Guard towers that had seemed merely observational suddenly revealed their true nature as weapon platforms, with automated systems emerging from hidden panels. Sarah watched this transformation with a mixture of professional satisfaction and personal vindication. The lockdown protocol was working exactly as designed, demonstrating the facility's ability to respond instantly to perceived threats. But she also felt a growing weight of responsibility for what she had set in motion. Every person on the base was now affected by her decision, their duties interrupted, and their safety potentially compromised by the emergency protocols. The most dramatic change was in the facility's electronic systems. Every computer screen within view had shifted to a bright red display showing the facility seal and the words "Lockdown active, Quantum Security Protocol engaged." This was the signature of the system Sarah had helped design, a failsafe that could only be triggered by one of the 12 quantum key devices currently in existence. Williams was now frantically typing on his keyboard, trying to access systems that were no longer responding to normal commands. "I can't get into anything," he told Harrison, his voice tight with stress. "It's like the entire network has been isolated. I've never seen anything like this before." Harrison, meanwhile, was fielding increasingly urgent radio calls from supervisors demanding to know what had triggered the alert. "Sir," Harrison spoke into his radio, sweat now visible on his forehead despite the air conditioning in the guard booth. "We haven't identified any external threats. The only civilian presence was..." He paused, his eyes suddenly focusing on Sarah, who was still standing quietly outside the checkpoint, her hands clasped behind her back as she watched the proceedings with an expression of calm professionalism. The realization hit both guards simultaneously. Williams looked up from his useless computer screen, his eyes widening as he stared at the small woman who had been the subject of their mockery just minutes earlier. "You," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What did you do?" Sarah stepped forward, her movement causing both guards to instinctively reach for their sidearms before they caught themselves. "I activated the quantum security protocol," she said simply, her voice carrying clearly over the sound of the alarms. "As I mentioned, I'm Dr. Sarah Chen, and I was called here to address a critical security vulnerability. Since normal verification procedures seem to have failed, I used emergency authorization to demonstrate the nature of the threat. Harrison's radio erupted with the voice of Colonel Martinez, his tone sharp and urgent. Checkpoint Alpha, we're showing the quantum protocol activation originated from your position. Report immediately on the nature of the threat and the identity of the individual who triggered the lockdown. The colonel's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to immediate answers, and Harrison's hands shook slightly as he keyed his radio. Sir, Harrison began, his voice cracking again. We have a civilian here who claims to be Dr. Chen, the cybersecurity consultant you were expecting. She says she activated the protocol. There was a long pause on the radio, filled only with static and the distant sound of vehicles moving rapidly within the facility. When Colonel Martinez's voice returned, it carried a completely different tone. Did you say Dr. Chen? Doctor.
Sarah Chen? The urgency in his voice had been replaced by something that sounded almost like panic. Describe her immediately.
Harrison looked at Sarah with new eyes, no longer seeing a lost civilian, but potentially recognizing someone whose presence here had meaning far beyond what he had initially understood.
Small Asian woman, early 30s, dark hair, civilian clothes. She has what appears to be legitimate credentials, sir. You idiots, came the colonel's voice, loud enough that Sarah could hear it clearly, even though the radio wasn't directed at her. That's Dr. Palin. Chen, she designed the quantum protocol. She's one of the most classified assets in the entire Department of Defense cybersecurity program. Get her to my office immediately and try not to cause any more damage than you already have. The change in atmosphere was immediate and profound. Williams, who had been laughing at her expense just minutes earlier, was now standing at attention with a look of horror on his face. Harrison had gone from dismissive to terrified. His earlier confidence completely evaporated as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. Dr. Chen, Harrison said, his voice now respectful to the point of being servile. I sincerely apologize for any misunderstanding. If you could please come with me, I'll escort you directly to Colonel Martinez's office. He had opened the door to his booth and was gesturing frantically for her to enter, his entire demeanor transformed by the revelation of her true identity. But Sarah didn't move. Instead, she stood quietly in the middle of the checkpoint, surrounded by the chaos she had created, and considered her options. The lockdown protocol would remain in effect until she personally deactivated it using her quantum key device. Every second it remained active cost the military thousands of dollars in lost productivity and resources. Hundreds of personnel were now confined to their positions, unable to complete their duties or leave their posts. I appreciate the apology, Sarah said calmly, her voice carrying clearly over the alarms that continued to pulse around them. But I think it's important that we address the real security vulnerability here, before I deactivate the protocol. She gestured around at the scene of controlled chaos that surrounded them. This lockdown wasn't triggered by an external threat or a computer virus. It was triggered by a failure of human judgment. Williams, who had been trying to make himself invisible behind his computer screen, looked up with confusion. I don't understand, Dr. Chen. What vulnerability are you referring to? Sarah pulled out her laptop bag and set it on the ground, then removed her quantum key device, holding it where both guards could see it clearly. This device can only be activated by someone with level Omega clearance, the highest security rating in the Department of Defense. The fact that I possess it should have been your first indication that dismissing me was a serious mistake, she continued, her voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a lecture to students who had failed to grasp an important concept. But more importantly, your willingness to turn away someone with valid credentials simply because they didn't match your preconceptions represents exactly the kind of thinking that hostile actors exploit. You assumed that a cybersecurity expert would look a certain way, dress a certain way, present themselves in a manner that matched your expectations. Harrison, now sweating profusely despite the air conditioning, tried to interrupt. Dr. Chen, we were just following security protocols. No, Sarah said firmly, cutting him off. You were following your own biases. Security protocols would have required you to verify my credentials, contact my supervisor, and ensure that any uncertainty was resolved through proper channels. Instead, you made assumptions based on my appearance and decided that someone who looked like me couldn't possibly be qualified to address the facility's cybersecurity needs. The implications of her words were beginning to sink in, and Sarah could see the understanding dawning on both guards' faces. If they could dismiss her so easily, despite her legitimate credentials and official authorization, what would happen when a real threat appeared? How many other qualified personnel might be turned away because they didn't fit someone's narrow idea of what a military professional should look like? The radio crackled again with Colonel Martinez's voice, now accompanied by the sound of vehicles approaching rapidly. Dr. Chen, this is Colonel Martinez. I'm en route to your position with a full escort. Can you please deactivate the lockdown protocol? We have critical operations that need to resume immediately. Sarah looked around at the scene one more time. The flashing red lights, the armed soldiers maintaining their emergency positions, the computer screens displaying lockdown warnings, and the two guards who had learned a lesson they would never forget. The facility had demonstrated its ability to respond to a genuine security threat, but the threat had come from within, from the very people tasked with protecting it. "Colonel Martinez," Sarah said, speaking directly to the radio that Harrison held toward her with shaking hands. "The lockdown will be deactivated once I'm satisfied that the security vulnerability has been properly addressed. I believe we have some important conversations ahead of us about the nature of security in the modern age." As if to emphasize her point, she held up the quantum key device where everyone could see it, the small black rectangle that had brought one of the most secure military installations in the United States to a complete standstill. In her hands, it looked utterly ordinary, just another piece of modern technology. But its power was absolute, and everyone present now understood exactly who was in control of the situation. Colonel Martinez arrived at the checkpoint in a convoy of 3 black vehicles, their tires screeching against the asphalt as they came to an abrupt stop just outside the lockdown perimeter. Sarah watched through the reinforced glass as a tall, imposing figure emerged from the lead vehicle, his uniform crisp and his bearing unmistakably that of someone accustomed to command. Behind him followed a group of high-ranking officers, their faces grim and their movements urgent, as they approached the checkpoint where she still stood calmly in the center of the chaos she had created. The colonel was a man in his early 50s, his grey hair cut in a precise military style, and his dark eyes sharp with intelligence, and barely contained frustration. As he approached the checkpoint, Sarah could see him taking in the scene. The flashing red lights, the soldiers maintaining emergency positions, the computer systems locked down and displaying quantum protocol warnings, and the 2 guards who looked as if they wished they could disappear entirely. "Dr. Power, Chen," Colonel Martinez said as he reached the checkpoint, his voice carrying the weight of authority but also a note of genuine respect. "I apologize profusely for this situation. These men clearly failed to follow proper procedures, and I assure you there will be consequences for their actions." He gestured toward Harrison and Williams, both of whom were now standing at rigid attention, their faces pale with the realization of how badly they had mishandled the situation. Sarah nodded politely but made no move to deactivate the quantum protocol. Instead, she stepped forward slightly, her quantum key device still visible in her hand, its presence a constant reminder of the power she wielded in this moment. "Colonel, I appreciate your apology, but I believe we need to have a more comprehensive discussion about what happened here today before normal operations can resume." The colonel's eyebrows rose slightly, and Sarah could see him calculating the cost of every minute the lockdown remained in effect. Behind him, other officers were checking their watches and speaking in urgent whispers about delayed operations and mounting expenses. But to his credit, Colonel Martinez remained focused on her, recognizing that she held all the cards in this particular situation. "Of course, Dr. Chen. What would you like to discuss?" His voice remained respectful, though Sarah could detect an undercurrent of tension as he struggled to balance his need to resolve the situation quickly, with his understanding that rushing her might only prolong the lockdown. Sarah gestured around at the facility, taking in the entirety of the military installation that had been brought to a standstill by her single action. This lockdown was triggered not by an external cyber attack or a computer virus, but by a fundamental failure in human judgment. "Your guards dismissed me not because my credentials were invalid or because I posed a genuine security threat, but because I didn't match their preconceived notions of what a cybersecurity expert should look like."
She paused, allowing her words to sink in before continuing.
"Colonel, in my work with the Department of Defense, I've encountered this same bias repeatedly. Qualified professionals being turned away, overlooked, or dismissed because they don't fit someone's narrow idea of what expertise looks like. This isn't just a matter of hurt feelings or political correctness. This represents a genuine security vulnerability that hostile actors can and will exploit." Colonel Martinez nodded slowly, his expression growing more serious as he began to understand the broader implications of what she was saying. "You're suggesting that our own biases could be weaponized against us."
"I'm not suggesting it," Sarah said firmly.
"I'm stating it as fact. Foreign intelligence agencies study our weaknesses, including our psychological and cultural blind spots. If your guards could dismiss someone with my credentials so easily, what happens when a threat arrives packaged in a way that exploits those same biases? What if the next cyber attack comes from someone who knows exactly how to present themselves to avoid suspicion? Behind the colonel, Major Thompson, his second in command, stepped forward with a tablet in his hands. Dr. Chen, we've calculated that each minute of lockdown costs approximately $47,000 in lost productivity and resources. We have critical operations that need to resume immediately. His tone was respectful but urgent, clearly hoping to expedite the resolution of the situation. Sarah turned her attention to Major Thompson, studying his face carefully before responding. Major, how much would you estimate it would cost if hostile actors successfully infiltrated this facility because our security personnel were focused on the wrong threat indicators? What's the value of the classified information, weapon systems, and personnel that could be compromised if our human security protocols fail? The Major's expression shifted as he considered her question, and Sarah could see him running calculations that went far beyond the immediate financial cost of the lockdown. Colonel Martinez, meanwhile, was nodding thoughtfully, clearly beginning to appreciate the magnitude of what she was describing.
You're absolutely right, Doctor.
Chen, the colonel said after a long pause. This incident has exposed a serious flaw in our security thinking. But I need to ask, was activating the quantum protocol really necessary? Couldn't we have addressed this through normal channels? Sarah held up her quantum key device, its black surface gleaming in the harsh desert sunlight. Colonel, I tried to address this through normal channels. I presented valid credentials, explained my purpose, and requested that you be contacted for verification. Your guards refused to even attempt to verify my identity. They made their decision based entirely on my appearance and their assumptions about what a cybersecurity professional should look like. She gestured towards Harrison and Williams, who were still standing at attention and looking increasingly uncomfortable as the conversation continued. These men represent the human element of your security system, and that element failed catastrophically. The quantum protocol exists precisely for situations where normal security procedures have been compromised. In this case, they were compromised not by enemy action, but by our own prejudices and blind spots. Colonel Martinez was quiet for several minutes, clearly weighing her words against the practical necessities of running a major military installation. Around them, the lockdown continued in full effect, with soldiers maintaining their emergency positions and systems remaining isolated from normal operations. The cost was mounting by the minute, but Sarah could see that the colonel was beginning to understand the broader lesson that needed to be learned. What would you recommend, Dr. Chen? He asked finally. How do we address this vulnerability without compromising our legitimate security requirements? Sarah smiled for the first time since arriving at the facility, recognizing that she had successfully made her point and that real change might be possible. I recommend a comprehensive review of your human security protocols, with particular attention to unconscious bias training for all personnel involved in access control. Your guards need to understand that threats come in many forms, and that making assumptions based on appearance or demographics can be just as dangerous as failing to detect a weapon or explosive device. She continued, her voice taking on the tone of someone outlining a professional recommendation rather than delivering a lecture. I also recommend regular testing of these protocols, using personnel who deliberately challenge assumptions and preconceptions. If your security team can learn to look beyond surface appearances and focus on actual threat indicators, you'll be much better prepared for the sophisticated attacks that are becoming increasingly common. Colonel Martinez nodded eagerly, clearly relieved to have a concrete path forward.
That makes perfect sense. We can implement bias training immediately and develop new testing protocols within the month.
Will that be sufficient to address your concerns? But Sarah wasn't finished yet. She turned her attention back to Harrison and Williams, both of whom had been silent throughout the exchange, but whose faces showed they had been listening carefully to every word. Actually, Colonel, I think the most important part of this lesson needs to come from the individuals who were directly involved in the incident. She stepped closer to the two guards, her expression serious but not unkind. Harrison, Williams, you both made assumptions about me that could have had serious consequences if I had been a genuine threat, or if there had been a real emergency requiring my immediate access to the facility. I need to know that you understand what went wrong and how you'll handle similar situations in the future. Harrison was the first to respond, his voice shaky but sincere. Doctor Chen, I realize now that I let my own expectations cloud my judgment. I should have followed proper verification procedures instead of making assumptions based on your appearance. I've learned a lesson today that I'll never forget, and I promise it won't happen again. Williams nodded emphatically, his earlier dismissiveness completely gone. Ma'am, I want to apologize not just for my failure to follow procedures, but for the disrespectful way we treated you. You deserved better from us, and the military deserves better security practices. This has been a wake-up call that I needed. Sarah studied both men carefully, looking for signs of genuine understanding rather than simple compliance. What she saw in their faces convinced her that the lesson had been truly learned. These weren't bad men or incompetent soldiers. They were simply human beings who had fallen victim to the same unconscious biases that affected people in every profession and walk of life. "Thank you both for your honesty," she said finally. "More importantly, I want to thank you for the way you handled this situation. You could have simply reported the guards' behavior through official channels, but instead you chose to create a teaching moment that will benefit our entire facility. Your actions today have made us more secure, not less." Sarah smiled and extended her hand to the colonel, who shook it warmly. "Colonel, the security of our military installations is too important to be undermined by unconscious bias or faulty assumptions. I'm glad we could turn this incident into an opportunity for improvement." As she gathered her belongings and prepared to finally enter the facility for the cybersecurity consultation she had originally been summoned to conduct, Sarah reflected on the events of the day. The mockery and dismissal she had experienced at the checkpoint had been painful, but the response it had generated would ultimately make the facility more secure and better prepared for future threats. Harrison and Williams, meanwhile, would never forget the day they learned that expertise comes in many forms, and that making assumptions based on appearance could have consequences far beyond anything they had previously imagined. The story of the small woman who shut down an entire military base with a single device would become part of the facility's folklore, a reminder to all personnel that in the world of national security, nothing is ever quite what it seems.